The Denver Broncos kick off OTAs this week, and one question looms largely. Will we see Courtland Sutton? If he doesn't appear, who can the Broncos expect to take the mantle on the leadership side of things? We'll break that down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's up? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get Locked on Broncos for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast every single day, all year long. So make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. As OTAs begin this week, we'll have you covered every step of the way. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Sayre, today's episode of the show, we got a lot to talk about as OTAs begin this week. There's a lot of action, a lot of moving pieces here. We'll look at which wide receivers Broncos Country should watch for at OTAs. Tim Patrick's leadership really going to be a big crucial element for them under one condition this week. And obviously the question we're going to kick things off with is, when will we see Courtland Sutton on the field again? A lot of questions for Broncos OTAs, but a lot of excitement because football, my friend, we're around the corner. It is back.
It is, and it feels like it too. I mean, with OTAs happening all across the league, the NFLPA rookie premiere, you get to see the new players in their new uniforms and things like that. I mean, it does feel like the NFL has done a good job of shortening the off season these days. Maybe it's just because you and I are busy with stuff all the time. Who knows? But it feels like it used to be a lot longer and more miserable of a wait. I guess maybe check with Cody and I at the beginning of the month of July or something like that and see how things are going. But right now it does feel like football's in the air. And hey, the Broncos right now, Cody, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the good vibes are only being hampered by one thing, and that would be Courtland Sutton not being out there. Now, the question, as you said, is going to be whether or not he shows up anytime soon for the Broncos. We're recording here in May, mandatory OTAs and things like that. I mean, obviously, that's a different story, but you want to see Sutton out there. He's the team's number one receiver. You got a brand new quarterback, and you certainly want him to be around, especially with 2 years left on his contract. I know that he only has the $2 million in guaranteed money left on his deal, which is why there's kind of a contract situation going on. But the Broncos have drawn a line in the sand. Like, they're not trading him. They're not getting rid of him. They clearly want to have him back. And so now it seems like it's a matter of time, but it would be a huge boost to the morale, I guess, of the team, I guess, from the outside looking in, or maybe just the overall vibes of the team to have Sutton pop in at OTAs here, especially as they get down to some on-field work for the whole roster.
And this is the most important time of the year, right? Because look, for Courtland, I think we got to look at a variety of different things here. Now, he has been training really, really crazy, not crazy, but he's been putting in a lot of work in Florida. He's staying in great football shape. He's doing on-field work. He's in strength training. He's doing all this cardio stuff. Like, he looks good physically right now. And so it's like the only question we have is, okay, hey, he's in the best shape possible right now. When are we going to see that introduced to what the Broncos are doing on field? Like, I think Courtland is the only player that is not expected right now, at least to be at OTA. So it's why we're going to ask the question, like, will we see him appear here at OTAs this week? Obviously, as everything kicks off on Tuesday in terms of on-field work, media gets access to one of these practices this week. And so we're waiting to figure out which practice that is going to be here. But how long will the Broncos and Courtland play this little game of tug-of-war that's going on there? Like, the Broncos, as you mentioned, they're adamant. We're not trading Courtland. We want Courtland here. Sean's talked to Courtland. George has talked to Courtland. And things are good, but the only thing that's not good is the business side. Like, he wants more guaranteed money. He wants that protection, rightfully so. The NFL is a what have you done for me lately type of business. And what has Courtland done for the Broncos lately? Well, he put up 10 touchdowns last season. And I think so much of the argument that you're going to see I feel like a lot of Broncos fans have turned on Courtland, Sayre, and to be honest with you, I don't like that. I mean, I don't like that just because of the fact that he's holding out so he can get more money. Like, you got to understand, folks, like the NFL and teams and the Broncos have had their fair share of instances where they have done a player dirty on the sake of the business side. So why is it that we demonize players and vilify them when they try to do what's best for them and their family going forward? And for Courtland, it's looking for more guaranteed money. Absolutely. Get it while you can in this game because it's a physically brutal game. Courtland has already dealt with a season-ending injury before. You got to capitalize as much as you can financially. 10 touchdowns. The market where he's at says, hey, he deserves a little bit more money than $2 million in guaranteed money left on his current contract. So if the Broncos are adamant, Sayre, on not trading away a guy like Courtland and they're focused on, hey, we want Courtland to be part of what we're doing, who's going to break, right? Like, the argument I want to make here is, okay, for Courtland, ideally, let's say Courtland shows up this week and is a show of good faith here. Is that going to open things up for the Broncos to be like, all right, hey, you're here. We appreciate you. Let's find a way to come to terms on something that makes sense for both sides. Like, don't drag this out deep into training camp, right? Because I think if you're going to roll with, let's say, Bo Nix or heck, any of these quarterbacks, for example, they need to have chemistry with the number one wide receiver on the team. And that is Courtland by and large there. But Denver's also made some contingency plans in the event that's not the case there. But I just think that you have to do that. Not to mention, Courtland is a leader inside that wide receiver room. He's a very good leader. Guys in that locker room, they love Courtland. They look up to him. So get him in the building, and it's good for everybody. I just want to know when this game of tug-of-war is going to end, to be honest with you.
And you can't help but think of that situation between the Denver Broncos and Ja'Wuan James from a couple of years ago, Cody, where I know that his situation was completely different in terms of where he stood with the team and missing all that time and being kind of a free agent bust. Like, I know Courtland is nothing even remotely similar to that. But what happened with Ja'Wuan James that final year in Denver was that he was working away from the team facility. Remember, the NFLPA seemingly encouraged players to go work out away from the team's facility, which ended up being a multi-million-dollar mistake on Ja'Wuan James's part. He was working out at the team facility. He took the NFLPA kind of recommendation to leave and did so, and then suffered a season-ending injury. And I believe, Cody, he had to pay the Broncos, upwards of $8 million or $10 million. I can't remember the exact figure. Maybe somebody in the comments will know. But remember, he had to pay the Broncos a bunch of money that was on a guaranteed salary for that year. And Denver saved all that money when he got hurt, unfortunately, away from the team facility. That's the last thing that Courtland Sutton wants to happen this year, is to get hurt away from the team facility and miss out on even more money than he is trying to get from the Broncos, because he's counting over 17 million against this year's salary cap. I mean, he does have a high salary this season. It's just the guaranteed money is almost gone completely in his deal. That's what he's fighting for now at the age of 28 going on 29. So we get it from that perspective. Like you said, go make the money while you can, but also, you better be careful with what you're doing away from the team facility. I would say, I hope that he comes back to Denver, Cody, in terms of just like for what's best for him and the team. But man, it's a business decision. He's got to make it on his own.
Yeah, and look, I think he's got a good group of people around him that are advising him on what to do, and I think ultimately Courtland is looking out for himself, which is what you should do in the NFL and the business side. Look, as much as we talk about loyalty, this and that, teams hardly show loyalty to players at times. You have to protect your bottom line. You have to protect your best interest. And for Courtland, that's making sure that, hey, like, he's secure, like he can make some more money. Like, that is what you want for all these guys at the end of the day. And sometimes it conflicts with maybe, what's best overall for the team. And so that's where I think the frustration creeps in there. But look, Broncos country, don't vilify Courtland Sutton. He's a guy that loves the Broncos. He wants to stay in Denver, contrary to a lot of the narratives that have been pumped out there. He's staying in great shape. We'll see when he decides to come to the mix. But Sayre, if he does not make it to the team facility for OTAs, all eyes are going to shift on Tim Patrick, who's coming off back-to-back season-ending injuries. Tim is the most tenured wide receiver inside that room. How important will his leadership be? We'll dive deeper to that here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country. Today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And make sure you get involved in the NFL season this year, especially with the Denver Broncos. If you want to make it to the Broncos home opener against the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 2, Game Time is the perfect place where you can go and you can get tickets. And not only that, you can get killer last-minute deals. You get all-in prices, views from your seat, and you get their lowest price guarantee. Game Time, they take the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets. And for that specific home opener, we don't know who the quarterback's going to be, but we do know that the Broncos are going to host Russell Wilson, his return to the Mile High City. Game Time allows you to take part in that. Not to mention, you can get flash deals where you save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. They also have last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more, plus all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
Tim Patrick's veteran leadership will be crucial for a young group of Denver Broncos wide receivers. Cody and I are going to break down exactly why one of the best teammates on the Denver Broncos could turn into one of the best comeback stories of the year in 2024. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts. And hey, if you haven't already, go jump over to YouTube and hit subscribe on Locked On Broncos over there. Or if you're already watching this on YouTube and you haven't yet subscribed, we would appreciate if you do that today. And we're talking about off-season activities. We're talking about the wide receiver position, one of the most glamorous positions in the NFL. And the Denver Broncos, to me, Cody, have maybe one of the best stories in the game at this position. And that's Tim Patrick, right? I mean, he broke his leg at Utah, potential career-threatening injury, had a great impression that he made throughout the offseason, signed with the Ravens, moved over to the San Francisco 49ers, had joint practices in Denver, impressed the coaching staff, gets signed to the Broncos practice squad, becomes a second contract player. I mean, his story is already amazing, but unfortunately, after signing that extension, he's missed 2 straight seasons. The Broncos have not seen him play on that contract extension yet. So here we are, and he's entering a pivotal season individually, but he's also going to be asked and counted on to be a leader for this young group of players.
Well, and he's already been that behind the scenes. And I think that's something that probably hasn't been as much public knowledge as most people would maybe, ask. Like, I think the whole offseason, we're like, all right, hey, how are the Broncos going to maneuver Tim Patrick's deal? Could it be a cap casualty? We saw the Broncos and Tim, they came to terms on a brand new contract, obviously, to keep him here in Denver. Sean Payton had huge plans for him in that role, specifically on the offensive side last year, and then training camp. I just remember watching it happen. It was, a trips bunch formation to the right. He went to go run a pivot route. Looked like he had slipped, but, he had popped his Achilles at that point, threw his helmet down in frustration. It was just gutted, like took the entire wind, like, and the fans were there too. Like, it took the entire wind out of the sails of everybody at that practice. And everyone's just like, oh gosh, like sitting around like, whoa, what's going on with Tim? And, we're sitting there at practice and we're getting updates like, yeah, it could be season ending. And then we're like, oh my goodness, like, just you feel bad for Tim because Tim is such a great guy. And obviously he's an impact playmaker for you too at the wide receiver position. One of the more reliable guys, more sure-handed players that you had on the roster. And unfortunately, back-to-back season-ending injuries, the ACL and the Achilles. But I'll tell you this, though. If Sutton continues to miss and is not able to be on OTAs, or let's say hypothetically he's not on the roster, the veteran presence now shifts from Courtland to Tim Patrick, because Tim at that point now becomes the most crucial voice for that position room. And that room has such high expectations now, especially, if Courtland is not on the team. I think you have to factor that in there, because you now have a rookie quarterback that you drafted 12th overall, and you're trying to build this offense around what he can do well and how it fits into what the team can do well overall, or shape their identity. For Tim coming off these 2 major injuries, one thing I can tell you is that even though he is fully healthy, Sayre, he's fully healthy, 100%, ready to go. The Broncos coaching staff, from what I'm told, they're going to ease him back into the swing of things here, which is the right move overall. And it allows him, I think, to not only just continue to get mental reps, he's going to get some on-field physical reps, but they're going to watch how much they put on him during the OTAs, during training camp. I don't think we'll see him play much in the preseason. We may see him play a couple of snaps, but he has also been another coach essentially on this team for the past 2 years behind the scenes, working with guys like Jalen Virgil, working with guys like Brandon Johnson. And now he's going to have a bigger impact, being on the field, being like another coach, an extension of what Kiri Colbert wants in that wide receiver room. He's been doing that for the past 2 seasons. So his leadership has already been crucial. And now he's in a position where not only can he physically demonstrate it and be on the field, but he can also serve that behind the scenes role for these young guys as well, which I think is absolutely important. And that's a huge factor here for OTAs this week.
And how big is it going to be for him to be able to go from being like, hey, do as I say now to do as I do, like, watch me do this. He'll be able to be out there on the field and doing these things and setting the example that way. I think that's a huge added value for him. And he has a chance to be maybe one of the best stories in the NFL this season. I mean, missing basically 2 straight seasons after you signed a big money contract. Now Tim Patrick can come back into the mix, and we'll see what kind of a role he plays. But I agree with what you just said about what the team's plan is. I mean, get this guy to the regular season, get him in a position to be able to play and contribute in the meaningful games to where you can actually utilize him as that big slot, or you can have his physicality there in the red zone. I mean, it's almost easy to forget like what he brings to the table as a player. He's one of the best blocking wide receivers in the league, in my opinion. And so you've got a guy that he embodies everything that I think Sean Payton looks for at this position. He's a physical player. He's sure-handed. He's a reliable player. He can move the chains. He can create yardage after the catch. He can win in the red zone in 50-50 situations. There's just so much about Tim Patrick that is special. And so we need to see him on the field. We need him out there this year as Broncos country, just to be, I mean, he's such an emotional, you see him on the sidelines after every big play down the Broncos sideline, right? I mean, he's always the first guy there to dap up his teammates, to celebrate a big play. Like, we need that energy on the field making the plays.
Well, and I think another thing too is what are some realistic expectations here for Tim Patrick, barring that he makes it through the offseason program, he makes it through training camp, makes it to the regular season. I think it would be irresponsible to place such heavy expectations on Tim. Like, okay, Tim needs to go out there. He needs to catch 89 passes for, 1,000 yards and however many touchdowns. I think the reality is, like, if Tim can have an impact for the Broncos, or let's just say this, like, statistics aside, putting that away, if Tim can just be an impact player this year, coming off the injuries where, let's say, hey, he's catching big passes on third down, he's keeping the Broncos drives alive. Let's say there's a game that the Broncos win, but, it's really set up by a big time first down conversion here by Tim Patrick. To me, that's where I think the expectation goes. Like, we sometimes, and look, I'm guilty of this as well as anybody else, we sometimes get so fixated on a player needs to have these types of stats, these types of numbers, but are they making the plays that are going to help the Broncos win, right? And if that's coming off of touchdown catches, which leads to points, which points obviously lead to better chances to win football games, or if it's a play that allows you to get in a position to kick a game-winning field goal, to me, that's where I look at player value and player impact more so than a statistical range. You can't quantify some of those things. You can look at stats, but they don't tell the full picture. For me, if Tim can come in and just be a productive player for Denver, can come up big for them in some crucial moments, to me, I think that's a successful season for Tim, all circumstances considered, coming off the ACL, coming off the Achilles, which, as we know, Sayre, about maybe 10 years ago, you had one of those injuries. It was, realistically speaking, the idea was career ender. Like, that's it. We're seeing guys recover. We're seeing medical technology advance. We're seeing guys come back and play even more better than they did before the injury off of some of these major injuries. So can that happen for Tim? I sure hope so. But I just think if he can just have an impact, that to me is what matters the most here for the Broncos.
It does. It's exactly what you need to see from him, from this wide receiver group. That the Broncos, it's not even about the investment that they made in that second contract at this point, right? I mean, that was the right thing to do, was to give him that deal, was to give him, reward him for what he was doing on the field. I mean, remember back in that 2021 season, he had dominated the Dallas Cowboys, and he had countless I think he had 0 drops that entire season. And so it is where the Broncos need to get him, is out there contributing to wins. It's not about okay, how can Bo Nix throw for 5,000 yards and split it up evenly between all the receivers? And okay, how many are we going to have 5 players with 10 or more touchdowns this year like we did in 2013? No, that's not what it's about here. But you want to see Tim Patrick contributing to wins. If that's the case, Cody, shoot, I mean, he could have one game where it's 20 yards on 3 catches, and he could have another game where it's 115 yards on 5 catches. Who cares? If the Broncos are winning games and Tim Patrick is helping them do that, that is going to be the storyline to follow in 2024.
Maybe we can start changing the mindset of how we all, like ourselves included as media members, fans as well. Like, let's stop just looking solely at stats and let's just look at the tape. Let's just look at the impact and let's use that to form the analysis of our opinions even further. I think that's a crucial element here as well. Tim Patrick, obviously his leadership is crucial to what the Broncos want to have done inside that wide receiver room. He's been big for Courtland Sutton. He's been an extension of that. But now, as the Broncos continue to maneuver out OTAs this week, all eyes are on the other wide receivers that are on this team that are not named Courtland Sutton or Tim Patrick. Who should Broncos fans keep their eyes on? We'll tell you that here and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, it's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. With the NBA, you have the Eastern Conference Finals and the Western Conference Finals kicking up here this week. FanDuel is the place to be to determine who's going to make it to the NBA championship. And you can bet inside these games exclusive. We know it's going to be highly competitive, but you can bet on things like player stat projections. You can go through and bet on whether or not a team's going to win straight out on the money line, or you can even get involved in point spreads. If you think the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to beat the Dallas Mavericks by more than 3.5 points, you can take that at FanDuel Sportsbook. And right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we'll dive deep into which wide receivers Broncos Country needs to pay attention to this week as OTAs continue in Dove Valley, as the team gets deeper into phase 3 of the offseason program, leading into mandatory minicamp in the month of June on June 11th through the 13th, where we'll have access to all 3 days of practice. And now in OTAs is the time where you get the early on impressions. You get to say, okay, hey, I'm keeping an eye on this. Throughout mandatory minicamp, this is what we're going to pay attention to. Obviously, going into training camp, we're going to look at every single position here. Wide receiver is a very interesting one. Real quick, I want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you. Make sure you subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long, from an objective point of view. Who should Broncos Country watch at the wide receiver position whose names aren't Courtland Sutton or Tim Patrick? I feel like a lot of the conversation, and I'm sure a lot of the excitement, is going to shift on, obviously, the Broncos rookies from this year's rookie class. We're talking about Troy Franklin, who, if you look at his tape, you're like, how did this guy fall in the NFL draft? You're looking at Devon Vele, who's obviously got a lot of experience, a little bit older as he's entering his rookie year in the National Football League at 26, 27 years old. A little bit of an anomaly in comparison to what you're used to, but obviously some early on impressions, no pads, things like that. You're seeing some of these things. You're seeing these reports that we've seen at practice. The guys look the part. Can they maintain that when the pads come on, when there is competition, when there is physical contact? Like, these are things we'll evaluate. A lot of excitement about the Broncos rookies, obviously, as we go forth into OTAs.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see what they do when there's, the veteran defensive backs out there and they're having to make adjustments throughout practice and things like that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and really it'll give us our telltale sign of whether or not these guys are going to be able to come out and contribute right away, meaning Troy Franklin and Devon Vele. But not only are they going to be competing against some veteran defensive backs, they're going to be competing against guys who are hungry for roster spots, right? I mean, guys who have already done the whole, hey, we were undrafted free agents. We were the guys being picked against. We were the guys that didn't get the big signing bonus coming out of college. We weren't drafted at all. The guys like Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, Lil Jordan Humphrey. to me, Cody, I want to start off by kind of maybe giving a focus, since we just talked about Tim Patrick coming back from injury. How about Jalen Virgil coming back this year after it looked like it was pretty clear he was on his way to a 53-man roster spot last year? He obviously made the 53-man roster in his rookie season back in 2022 and had the big touchdown against the Tennessee Titans and things like that. But especially now, and we talked about this a couple of days ago, especially now with the return rules the way that they are, I think Jalen Virgil gets a massive boost when it comes to the overall outlook. I mean, I'm not comparing these two situations exactly the same, but remember last year, all throughout the offseason, we were both kind of like, I don't know how Tremont Smith is going to make the roster at corner. Like he's not doing much at the cornerback position. He's getting paid a lot of money to play just special teams. And we saw how valuable that was to Sean Payton, that he was out there for every single game last year on the active roster. How important is it going to be for Jalen Virgil this year in terms of his overall special teams impact? We know he can play a little receiver as well, and he's obviously very good at it, but maybe the return game is his ticket to this roster.
Well, not only just the return game, but also just being a gunner. Like, I think we all forget in 2022, Jalen Virgil was one of the Broncos' top gunners toward the end stretch of the season last year. And look, that wide receiver room got decimated by injuries in 2022. But for Jalen Virgil, he's a guy that's just explosive. He's fast. He's a guy that has just great heart, great effort, great energy, gets downfield. Now, to me, I think why we're going to factor in return. I would keep Marvin Mims as the team's punt returner, but I would make every effort possible to put Jalen Virgil as the kick return specialist here for the Broncos. Take Marvin off that. Look, I know like the rules are changing, and it's going to be designed to where you're going to keep the return more so in the game. You're going to have more chances at explosive plays. But if Marvin Mims has an envisioned larger role here for the Broncos offense and for Peyton this year, do you risk him getting injured on special teams? And then you find yourself in a situation like, what do we do in this situation? I am very curious to see what the Broncos plan to do, because I could really see that happen where, hey, we're going to keep Jalen Virgil on the 53-man roster. He's going to be our starting kick return artist, and maybe another guy that you can throw in there has nothing to do with wide receiver, Blake Watson potentially. This is where he can maybe earn a roster spot more so than a crowded running back room. But you look at all these guys that you mentioned, and look, I think we got to highlight Brandon Johnson. Someone said that we were disrespecting Brandon Johnson last week by not mentioning him enough. Like, look, Brandon has been impactful, but the Broncos have made moves essentially to replace some of these guys, like to elevate, to raise the level of competition there. And this will be good for Brandon Johnson. This will be good for Lil Jordan Humphrey. This will be good for David Sills V. This will be good. I think who's another receiver? Michael Bandy's on the roster still at that point. Mm-hmm. Philip Dorsett is another name that we could also watch in the return game. I think in terms of competition between Jalen Virgil and maybe obviously Philip Dorsett. Overall, I just think that this roster right now for Sean Payton at wide receiver specifically has so many guys right now. There's opportunities for competition all across the board where I look at it and I'm thinking to myself, okay, like hypothetically on paper, we can project who we think. If Denver's going to keep 6 wide receivers, we can project and think, we know who it may be. But this is where I think things are going to get fun. I think that 5th and 6th wide receiver spot for the most part will be up for grabs here in training camp, and that all begins this week. So keeping an eye on Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Philip Dorsett, David Sills V, and obviously Troy Franklin, Devon Vele. Like all these guys are going to be factored into the consideration for what Denver wants to achieve in that room in terms of elevating and raising the floor of that room. I think that's going to be an exciting element for us to watch this week.
And that war on attrition in recent years with all the injuries has caused this to be a very difficult discussion, hasn't it? I mean, when you add guys to a room and when everybody's healthy going into the offseason program, then you start having to talk about, well, is this guy going to make it or not? A guy who may have played a key role last year like Brandon Johnson or Lil Jordan Humphrey. I mean, those guys are going to be fighting for their roster lives after the Broncos went out and added Josh Reynolds. They draft Troy Franklin. They draft Devon Vele. You get Tim Patrick back on a renewed contract for this season. And so it is just by the very nature of it going to be more difficult. And those reps, it'll be fascinating to see how they're split up. I mean, we may not know until we start getting to the training camp days when fans are in the stands and start talking about that, Cody, because I know there's restrictions on it for the media, but man, how are those reps going to be split up, and where are the Broncos going to personnel groupings? Again, anytime we bring up wide receiver position for this team, personnel groupings are huge. And so I think, the coaching staff, they've gotten to know a lot of these guys over the last year. and the evaluation period now it's going to be it's kind of like the Joker, you know, in the Dark Knight. He breaks the pool cue over his leg and he's like, we're having tryouts, you know. and so that's kind of the dog eat dog style that the Broncos have going on right now at their offseason activities. I mean, you can't play any sort of sentimental favorites at this point. They're not going to be able to compromise if somebody like Jalen Virgil comes out and dominates as a returner this offseason. They're not going to be able to say, well, we just drafted Devon Vele, we got to keep him. There's going to be some hierarchy there, I think. But, man, you really want the best 5-6 guys, maybe even more than that. How much special teams plays into it, we'll see. But I think that's going to be this position group right here, to me, is maybe the most fascinating on the roster going into offseason program.
Obviously, Broncos Country's OTAs continue throughout this week. What are some of the biggest storylines you have for the Broncos wide receiver position? When do you think we'll see Courtland Sutton back on the field again? And is there a specific wide receiver that you have your eyes on as OTAs continue in Dove Valley? As chemistry is being built with Bo Nix, Zach Wilson, and Jarrett Stidham. A lot of exciting things down the pike. There's one practice I'll be able to attend this week. Not sure which one exactly yet, but we'll have you covered. And for all you everydayers out there in Broncos Country, the cornerback position is also another area that Sayre and I have various questions about as it pertains to Patrick Surtain. What can we expect from him in a big-time contract year? Who's going to rise up for that cornerback 2 job? And is the nickel position up for grabs? Those are things that we'll ponder on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.